Hey, everybody, welcome to episode 391 of the Running Rogue podcast. This is your host, Chris McClung, joined virtually by James Dodds. We are not in our cool green screen studio this week. We are virtually because I had some travels. But James, how are you? You got a little different background.
Yeah, I'm doing well. This is my front living area for the world to see. But
Nice.
yeah, and no blurred background. So I guess it's on. There's my couch.
Yeah.
There's my chair.
You'll have to check the YouTube if you want to see what the real world looks like behind us in a virtual environment. I've got part of the green screen behind me, big boom swinging mic in front of me, and a few days growth of beard trying to match you over there, coming back from a ski trip with my two sons, which was a lot of fun. But we're excited to be back with you today, virtually or not, to talk about the next chapter in our conversation of the book as we're getting into kind of the tactics of how you put together a training program. And essentially today, if I could summarize it, we're going to be talking about long-term planning. Like, how do you think about your training over not just a 5 or 6 month training block or 4 month training block, but over a 12 to 18 month training block? And then how do you make sure you're working on the right components in that window of time so that you can set yourself up for success? So we're going to be talking about what we like to call macrocycles today. And basically, how do you think about your training in big chunks so that you can set yourself up to go get a big goal down the road? And I would say, and I want you to react to this statement, I would say that in general, people aren't thinking about their training in long-term enough windows. We're always thinking about what's next, what's the next race, which is understandable. But if you give yourself a longer term view, you can, I think, and again, we'll test this with your perspective, you can get more out of your training because you're being a little bit more strategic about how it all fits together to work on your weaknesses towards your goal. But I'll pause there and get your reaction to that statement.
We're in complete agreement or in alignment. Because if you think about it, like some of the stuff we've talked about in the earlier podcast already, in the same way that you point your nose at something, focus on it, put in the training, you get better over time. You talking about the aerobic engine you can develop for 15 to 20 years. Like it's like, because of everything we've already said, I think it should be easier to trust that I get better and better and better over time. And so there's those cumulative gains that happen. It's like there's only so much you can do in one training block. And then when we get into the specifics of training itself, like polarizing it and moving down and getting faster and then coming back to the marathon, I think it's easier for athletes to start to see that, oh, it's like compound interest. Just like if I put money into the market and I keep feeding it and I leave it alone, it just grows exponentially over time. We get that exact same feedback loop in the way of training itself.
Yeah, you're right. So just like we got to think about long-term planning for our financial future, we have to think about long-term planning for our training future in order to figure out how it all fits together to get where you want to go. And as I said earlier, I think most people aren't thinking about it in a long-term enough viewpoint, but that can be hard for people because it's overwhelming. Like, how do you think about it in long-term chunks when you're just thinking about your next race? And so in the book, chapter 7, we start to talk about that. And then in coming chapters, we'll get to concepts like periodization and how you sequence your work. But for this chapter, we're really talking about how do you chunk those big chunks of work they're in 4 to 5 month chunks or across 12 to 18 months so that it all fits together in a way that's additive. So you're working on the right things. So you're thinking long-term enough. So we're going to kind of break that down in this conversation because obviously you need to think about the training components of that, but then also racing along the way and how those things fit together to get the milestones and checkpoints you need to see if you're making progress. So that's what today is about. I think it might make some people uncomfortable again because they're not used to thinking about in these long-term periods. But as you just alluded to, that's the name of the game with running. You can keep improving for decades if you keep doing it consistently, and you want to make sure that there are no accidents in that process by making sure you're planning things out in long-term with a long-term perspective. And it doesn't mean that anything has to be written down in pen and you have to commit to doing exactly this in 12 months, but it does mean you at least pencil things in and have a general idea of where you're headed. So as we jump into this, the chapter and in this conversation, we'll start with just a definitional question that gets to that word we used earlier, which is macrocycle. And I'll ask it to you. What do we mean when we talk about macrocycles?
Well, to stay in alignment with the book, I'll answer it in two ways. Like in the book, we talk about what you just presented, the 18-month view, or the multi-program view. So it's the broadest term that we can put on it. It's macro, high level, as opposed to micro, like the micro details of the day to day. And so, or like a microcycle could be a week, and a mesocycle, a phase of training. But a macrocycle is to describe that long-term plan. Now, more colloquially, like when we're talking just amongst people, I will often refer to a macro cycle as the 24-week, 22-week plan that we have setting up for that season. So it's gotten to where it's slipped in more casually, like, hey, check out the macro. And I'm usually referring to like the 20 to 22 week approach. But yes, included in the definition, to be true to it, would be that wider long-term view that you just teed up.
Yeah. So it's at least a 5-month picture of what your training looks like. Could be longer than that. And again, we kind of want you to look in 12 to 18-month windows. And inside of those 12 to 18-month windows might be 2 to 3 training blocks or 2 to 3 macros that are building inside of that have different unique goals and purposes. And so you might have a marathon macro in there. You might have a half marathon macro in there. You might have a speed macro in there across 18 months. You might have those 3 different types of training programs represented in an 18-month plan, all designed to work on different elements, all designed to build towards an ultimate goal that would be ahead. And I've had these conversations recently with athletes because I want to drill in just for a second on why it's so uncomfortable for people to talk about the 12 to 18-month window versus the 3 to 6-month window. And I've had a few conversations recently that makes me reflect on this, and it's just interesting to me. You know, I'll ask people this question, and I'll phrase it just kind of in an example format so people can hopefully understand. If someone, for example, has a goal to, as a female, has a goal to break 3 hours in the marathon, just as an example, as their primary number one goal, they might have a goal along the way to qualify for Boston as a female that can run, 3:25 and with the appropriate buffer get into Boston. So that's an interim goal along the path to sub 3. But more often than not in these conversations that I might have, the Boston goal will preempt the bigger goal in a sense that people are more focused on the short-term need to get to Boston than they are the big picture to get to sub 3. And I'll ask again, posing this to a hypothetical athlete, I'll say, what's more important to you, getting to sub 3 or getting to Boston sooner? Because those two things might actually be competing interests. It might be better for you to delay the Boston trip in order to more quickly get to sub 3. But it's really hard to get people to think about those types of trade-offs. So posing that as an example, what does that wake up in you?
Well, first that I agree. So I was sitting there listening, and I guess it woke up as to maybe expounding on potential reasons as to why someone may not want to do. But I agree that, yeah, it is competing interest, which causes its own friction, which could be a reason why they don't want to do it in the first place. But I think there's others that are starting to come to mind.
Yeah, I mean, and some of it comes down to this, I don't know, I think it's a modern societal need in a sense to kind of get what you want right now. There's a pressure for immediacy.
Mm-hmm.
It's like everything is quickly at our fingertips in a sense. Social media, news, scores, whatever it is, we can get to it right away. And so there's this kind of societal pressure to get what you want right away. I think there's also a little bit of a FOMO, a fear of missing out kind of pull where it's like, man, everybody's going to Boston. I want to go too. So
Mm-hmm.
therefore, let's make some trade-offs to get there sooner versus thinking about the long-term perspective, which I understand. Believe me, I'm not throwing stones at that pull or trying to judge people for that pull, because I totally get it and understand. But it can be really hard as a coach to convince someone to delay that immediate gratification in order to get to their bigger goal faster. And maybe there's also a bit of just not necessarily seeing the connection, kind of the go slow to go fast connection, perhaps. But at this point, I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah. No, and I think there's also there. It's hard to remove this from like motives and a willingness to do work. Like sometimes securing a win gives you the confidence to go secure another win. So there's ways that I think we can connect and relate. But also, I think if you're going to work that hard and invest that much time, I think talking about it investment language, it's like, wait, you're already here showing up doing all of this. Why not get the most out of it that you possibly can? Which opens up that, well, this 18-month view gets you even more, but you delay the gratification. Back to your point of immediacy, I guess. I also
Right.
think buried under there, there's also, I had a conversation with someone, this was outside of running, but it kind of reminded me that there's only a certain smaller percentage of people that I think are very comfortable being decisive. But I think if people sit with this, for a lot of people, truly being decisive is hard. Like we know that if you don't want to be in a constant state of reactivity, then you should get very proactive and set yourself up in such a way that you're not constantly dealing with reactive measures. And it's a similar concept here of like, well, then why wouldn't you do it? Because I think it requires being decisive. And back to that FOMO piece you brought up, it's like you have to clear things out of the way and say, when I say yes to one thing, it means I'm saying no to other things. And that point in being decisive, I think, is quite hard for a lot of people. And even those willing to embrace it, I think it might actually sometimes take a coach to sort of paint the picture, let you know it's a possibility. So some just don't know that it's even a possibility, and what they could get out of it. Some of them, it's like they struggle with being decisive. Some of them, and I think a lot of people maybe haven't even investigated all of these reasons. So some just don't know, you know?
Right. Yeah. And on the don't know theme, I think there's also that lack of perspective or understanding of how you get to a long-term goal and recognizing the pieces of the picture or puzzle to get there. If somebody wants to be a sub 3 hour marathoner, then that means that they need to be spending a significant amount of time not training the marathon, right? They need to be dropping down to the 5K, 10K, getting those times to a certain place in order to make a 650 mile feel efficient enough to carry it for 26.2 miles. Same thing with the half marathon, and as we've talked about in our kind of principles in prior episodes, all of those pieces of the puzzle are important to get to that goal. But some people, instead of building those foundational elements, would rather say, all right, I'm just going to go marathon to marathon to marathon until I hit that BQ, at the cost of shortchanging their pursuit of the bigger sub 3 goal, because they're not able to run fast enough in a 5K to sustain 650 for 26.2. They become very plateaued at running, call it 740 for the marathon. So that's a part of it. But again, not throwing stones, but just trying to illuminate and hopefully wake up in somebody who's listening the resistance that they might be feeling when we just talk about 12 to 18 months. Like, I just want people to be able to say, oh, okay, intellectually, I understand what they're talking about. And now I'm starting to relate because they're talking to me a little bit with some of
Mm-hmm.
these conversations. And hopefully that's enough to trigger something in you that says, hey, maybe I should think about this a little bit differently. And so when we're thinking in these 12 to 18 month blocks, again, these are concepts that you're writing down in pencil. So it's not something you're married to in pen. but you're thinking, okay, if I want to get to a big goal in 18 months and I need to chunk that up because we've talked about there's only 2 or 3 peaks you can manage in an 18-month window. I need to chunk that up into 2 or 3 peaks. Then what do those, just call it 6-month training blocks, look like times 3 in the 18-month window? And how is each one of them additive in a way to get me towards that 18-month goal? And so each macro cycle within the 18-month window would look like understanding for those 6 months what type of race you're training for, what the specific goal might be for that race, what the training objectives are outside of just getting a goal time, such as building volume, increasing the intensity with which you can run, adding strides to the equation, whatever it may be that's foundational. And so you have your goal, your purpose in terms of the race distance, your training objectives you're trying to achieve, and you're piecing together basically the summary of what you're trying to accomplish in each of those 6-month chunks, so that when you go to write the microcycle or mesocycles and microcycles, the details of those training blocks, you know how to put it together. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that you even layered in like training objectives in addition to it. Because at first I was just thinking of the linear mathematic, like, hey, go after like a marathon block and you get strong and you set that current best time, and then you pop over to speed and work shorter and faster to make those times feel easier, like you said. But there's these other nuanced layers that you just added in too, like certain training objectives that you want out of each block.
Yeah, and by looking at it with that type of view, you can also say, all right, am I making reasonable assumptions about how I can progress? Because kind of underneath each of those macros should be a concept of what's my peak mileage for that macro cycle. And as we talked about in a few episodes ago, you don't want to build your peak mileage from one macro cycle to the next by more than about 20% as a total weekly volume number. And so what is that going to be from one macro cycle to the next, so that I'm not jumping volume too quickly to overload the system? And then what are the other objectives I'm layering in, so that you're making small incremental gains that build one upon the next, so that the body can handle those adjustments while also working on the weaknesses you need to build along the way. And it forces a sort of planning process that not only helps you map out what the future should look like, but also helps you make sure you're not missing anything on the path to whatever you want to do. And, part of this is you can plan on your own. Obviously, it helps to have a coach you can advise with along the way to understand maybe what you can't see yourself. But I think simply the exercise of doing this type of work every 12 to 18 months is going to force you to have more clarity on what you're trying to accomplish in your training. It's going to also force you to be more holistic about how you approach your training, and then therefore give you better odds at getting whatever you want. So think in those 12 to 18 month windows, how do each of those macro cycles work in those 18-month windows? And then the question becomes, okay, well, how do I start to figure what that looks like? What is the process or the approach that we have to get there? And for us, it starts with being really, really clear on the number one thing you want. So we'll kind of spend time on that for a second. Everybody will list, if you ask them why they run, they'll often list 5 or 6 things, sometimes more, sometimes a little less. And yet it can be hard sometimes to pin people down on what's the most important goal you have and why. And I think that is the beginning of this kind of planning process. You can't do this work and this planning unless you understand what's true north, What's the most important thing for you when it comes to your running journey? The number one goal and the why behind that number one goal. And necessarily, you cut everything else out, you know, at least for the purposes of planning. That's not to say there can't be secondary layers and goals to it, but for the purposes of this planning process, we want you to say, regardless of timeline, what's the most important thing you want in the sport? The top goal. And why do you want it? That's where we start. And if you can't do that, then you can't do the planning. You can't figure out what's important and how to break it down from a process standpoint. Again, that's a harder thing to say than it is to do because it forces a level of prioritization that sometimes people are uncomfortable with, but it also forces a level of clarity that becomes then really actionable. So that's where we always have people start. And again, just to emphasize, that's regardless of timeline. So if you don't know how long it's going to take you to get wherever you want to go, that's okay. That's not the purpose of this initial step. It's more just what do you want and why? And what's the most important thing that you want? Again, hard for people sometimes to pin that down, but if they can do that, then everything else starts to fall into place afterwards.
Yeah. It's like a compass. Like you need the North Pole in order to know, we need a North Pole so that we can figure out the directions. And then we find out where you're going from there based on the compass. But the compass doesn't even work without the North Pole. So.
Right. And then again, it kind of then allows you to take the weed off the chaff, so to speak, and really focus on the thing that matters so that then you can plan towards that one goal. And the goal can be anything. It could be, to run a certain distance for the first time. It could be to hit a certain time, sub 5 hour marathon, sub 4 hour marathon, sub 3 hour marathon, Boston qualifier. Could be 2 hour half, 1:30 half, whatever you can dream about, it can be. And then once you lock in on that, and we also want you to generally put a purpose behind that. Why does it matter to you? So that it has a little bit more teeth and meat. And then from there you say, all right, well, what's it going to take? What is a phrase we like to use around here at Rogue is what does the race require or what does the goal require? So then you can take that true north as your goal, ask yourself, okay, what is it going to be required or what is required for me to get there? Compare that to where your gaps are and then start to build a plan that addresses those gaps and magnifies the strengths that will get you there. And so that's how it all kind of starts to trickle into place. But it starts with understanding what's true north. What if, or let me ask you this. So what do you think, how do you help someone figure out true north? Like if they're struggling?
It's a good question. I mean, like generally speaking, I would say it's like why work, but it's a constant sort of investigation, kind of using the Socratic method. It's like you want to qualify for Boston. Like, why do you think that is? It's like, well, that's a special marker. That's sort of a benchmark that a lot of people hit. And so you take that language and you turn that into yet another question. Why is it important to me to hit benchmarks that other people recognize as good, so to speak? And then whatever question flows out of that answer, you pull down again and say like, well, why is that important to you? Until you get to what you might consider a core level motivator to kind of help even that individual figure out exactly what it is that they're up to. But the lower you go, the more individualized it becomes. So I could say cleanly that it's, hey, consider what you're doing and why you think you're doing it and be open and willing to use the Socratic method to constantly ask yourself, but why is that important? And whatever answer you give yourself, it's, but why is that important? And you keep going down until you get that core driver.
The other thing I like to do here is also just brainstorm in a sense and be comprehensive. Like, what are all the things you want? Let's list the 5 or 6 things you want and then start to pit them against each other in a sense to really figure out which one's most important. Because somebody might be, well, I want to run an ultra someday. I want to run a 50 miler, or I want to run a certain time in the marathon or the half marathon or the 5K. And so you kind of get that list out there, and then you start to pit them against each other and say, all right, well, what really matters the most? If I could only do one thing on this list before I leave this planet, what's the one I really want the most? So that's another way to get to it. And then, like you said, then you got to kind of go to the why and ask the why question, the 5 whys to get to the very, very core of it. And then from there, you can also try it on for size. It's like, all right, well, I'm going to live with that in my head as true north for a while and just see how it feels. You know, if I find myself constantly daydreaming about how to get there, you're probably on the right track. If I find myself wandering to other goals, then maybe I missed characterized the most important priority.
Yeah.
But either way, you've got to kind of give yourself that chance to let it marinate, and then not be afraid to make a choice, because there might be a lot of things that are important to you, but we don't do this stuff to the point of listening to podcasts about it if we don't have things that really matter to us. So be bold, be brave, be willing to declare, hey, this is the most important thing for me, which is very scary, because then that's vulnerable in a sense. It also puts you out there. Whereas if you don't get that someday, then you're going to feel perhaps that you're not worthy of the goal. And so it's a scary, vulnerable thing to start to make these declarations, but it is the bold step towards getting it, towards getting what you want, is by just saying, hey, declaring it. I want this and I want it so badly that I'm willing to prioritize it as the top thing and then figure out how to get there.
Yep. And that's ideal, but one more thought on your question, to honor it the way it was asked. Like if they're truly lost, or if like they're brand new, then similar to the training, I would say we tell them, then go get your next step, go get your next win. And in that process, pay attention, because things wake up for you. You might set out to run a marathon, and it's interesting when someone crosses the line, if they're thinking, I like that and I could have done it faster, then you're immediately into a talk track about how to, quote, get faster and periodize. But if it was more of like, no, I loved the experience and that was amazing, and I witnessed the best of humanity, and I just want more of that in my life, and because they're still figuring things out, it's like, well, at least you've already identified one of the major components for yourself. Like again, on the idealistic end, they start with those bigger questions and they look at the 18-month viewpoint. And if they're new and truly lost, I would say, let's go take that next step and see what starts waking up inside you as you experience performance gains. And it was like, did that feel good? And do you want more of that? So you lead them along. Sometimes it can take a while.
Yeah. And you might find out along the way that you prioritize something else more, and that's okay. You know, you've given yourself a chance to try something on, to make a decision, to declare. And then as you start opening doors towards that goal, maybe you find your interest going somewhere else, and then you make that shift and pivot. Sort of like the never-ending career search. You know, I had a mentor one time tell me in career path that you don't have to know what you want to be when you grow up. Like, I think there's this idea, especially in American society, where we have to figure out our passion and figure out our true purpose and potential from a career perspective early on in life, and then go do it. And he's like, that's not how it works. He says, you don't have to know what that is or what you want to be when you grow up, because honestly, we never really arrived there. But you do have to know what you want to try. And so pick something, go try it, go do it, open doors in that direction, and keep opening them as long as you love it. And then as soon as you find out you don't like it, figure out the next thing to go try.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like that. It's like, ultimately, if you're still not sure at the end of the day, pick something using your gut and your best intuition, and then go start opening doors in that direction. And if you love it, keep going. And if you don't love it, pick the next thing. But we want you to be bold in your declaration and not indecisive, because the more you can pick a path, we believe, the better you can get gains towards that long-term potential, whatever it might look like. So step one in all of this, pick your path, pick your true north. And then from there, once you decide that, and by the way, that may not be something you can achieve in 18 months, but we think it's sort of silly and unrealistic to plan beyond 18-month windows. So you might say, well, it might take me 3 or 5 years to get there. Okay, that's fine. Well, what's a checkpoint along the way that's 18 months out that I can build towards? And then once you have that established, then it's a matter of figuring out again what the macro cycles look like in that 18-month window to build towards that either big goal or that interim step towards that big goal. And I would submit that, as we've talked about on prior episodes, then that's going to look more diverse than it is just training for one type of race. But I think it also requires one, just a fundamental perspective of how do you build long-term potential in the sport. We've talked about some of the fundamentals of that already. But two, also your understanding of your starting point and your weaknesses that you need to work on and build towards. You know, some people, and we see this quite often as they get into the half marathon or the marathon, they might be newer to running in general or racing, and they become decent at those distances while neglecting the shorter stuff. And so if you're somebody who comes from that type of background, you're going to need to work on some speed, perhaps in the 18-month windows. Or there's the flip of that, where you might have somebody that came in from like a soccer background, or maybe they ran track in high school and they already have that natural speed and they're pretty good over the short distances, but they need to build that aerobic foundation to sustain that for longer periods of time. And so maybe their priority isn't to go do a bunch of 5Ks and 10Ks. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe it's to focus on volume building over the course of 18 months. So you kind of have to marry that true north with a 18-month interim step, and then match that with your weaknesses to figure out, all right, how can I chunk up these 18 months in a way that works on 3 different weak spots as an example in order to take the next big step towards that goal. And so this is where we kind of talk macro cycle planning and objectives. And then we start to think about periodization. Periodization is a term I use both within a macro cycle, from base building or priming to strength phase to race specific phase to taper. But also I think about it across macro cycles, where I will say, you know, you've got to make sure you're working on all the different types of speed levels so that you don't become one dimensional in one direction. So periodization to me applies both within and across macro cycles, if that makes sense. But the question then becomes, all right, how am I periodizing the work over 18 months to make sure I'm working on the weaknesses while building the skills I have to go get the ultimate goal that I want? As I talk through that, and I'll ask a question and then I'll step into an answer from my side and you can be thinking about your answer. You know, just what are some examples of what that might look like? I think this is better answered in that format, you know, versus trying to give people all the different possibilities. But you might have, again, I've already kind of alluded to some of them. You might have somebody who's really good at staying power. Maybe they've spent time already working the half and the full and just haven't worked on the 5K or 10K. So we've got to make sure we're spending time on those shorter distances on speed tracks before they go back to a marathon. You might have examples where people need to be building volume. Maybe they're newer in their journey and they're at 20 miles a week and they need to be getting to 40 miles a week in order to have a chance at their goals. And so maybe their macro cycles are really more about that than anything else, going from 20 miles a week to 30 miles a week to 40 miles a week over the course of several macro cycles. Maybe it's about adding quality in a way that's sustainable. And so maybe you sort of have a baby version of quality in one macro cycle where you're doing just strides and maybe some light priming workouts. Then you go to the next macro cycle and you have a more robust version of it, but still maybe a light quality where you're doing traditional workouts, but in a way that's geared towards a rising runner or a newer runner. And then in that third macro cycle within an 18-month window, you kind of put it all together and do the full rigor of workouts to make it all point towards the goal that you want. And so those are some examples that I think about. What do you think about?
For a periodization across a year, I think of it, the number one word I hope that people keep in their mind when they look at the annual perspective is the word polarity itself. Because if you've gone towards the marathon distance, well, then you can trust that you've got a big engine and well, a growing engine, growing bigger over time. But you're quite strong and you lose that sort of touch on how sharp and fast you are. And so I highly recommend that they follow that up with a speed block or a half marathon block. And then someone on the newer end, I think they can periodize it in such a way, if they were truly getting into the sport and coming up, then that's a cool opportunity. Even though most people don't do it this way, it's a cool opportunity to actually build it in a linear fashion. Like spend that first block focused on 5K or 10K training where they're developing speed, volume is growing, and then they lay down a race and manage it quite well, but in smaller doses. Recover, go to a half track, recover, go to a full. Once they've hit up to that full, then they're kind of in that interim or that steady state, so to speak, in the way of like ongoing. I go long and strong for the marathon. I go short, sharp, and fast for the speed track. I go long and strong for the marathon. So that's a bit of a pattern that I think people can expect and plug in their mind. That's very easy and simple.
Yeah. And continuing that thought process for us, we, regardless of really what your goal is, this might affect the sequence. Your primary goal might affect the sequence, but we generally want to see you do a speed track, a half track, a full track if you're running marathons within an 18-month window. So you're kind of getting one of each and not over indexing on just one distance. Again, regardless of what your ultimate goal is, because that variety allows you to stay well rounded as a runner, work the full into the range, not become one dimensional. Because when we start going from one race instance to the next of the same variety, that's when we see people plateau, lose connection with their speed or lose connection with their staying power in a way that then limits their potential. So that's a rule of thumb, is to make sure you have that variety within the 12 to 18 month period, sequenced according to what might be most important to you. We think we've already talked about using volume as a dimension that can build across macrocycles. We think about quality, level, and intensity can build across macrocycles. And those are probably the three primary dimensions. And then obviously there can be more nuance within that, as again, depending on where your starting point is. So think about all of those things. Ideally get a coach that can help you. But if you don't have a coach, then at least put some thought to it yourself. And you can always jump on one of our Friday Q&As at 2 p.m. Central at Rogue Running and get some input from us if you need to. But it shouldn't be a random walk through your journey. If you want to get your goal, then you need intention and planning to get there. So that's all we're talking about. And as we progress through the book, we also will give you more tools to help build the journey along the way. So this is kind of just a teaser to start to frame up how you think about it. And we'll obviously get to more detail as we go. So that's a picture of kind of the planning and the training side. Then the next question becomes, okay, well, how do races fit into that plan? And as we've talked about before, you want to peak 2 or 3 times within a 12-month window, maybe even 2 or 3 within an 18-month window. And so your peaks are your A races, or the most important races that sit at the end of each of those macro cycles. Those should be penciled in to bookmark or to indicate the milestones for each segment of the journey. We'll talk in a second about how you choose those. And then you might perhaps do what we now call C races along the way that would point towards those A races and give you some bats to work on things along the way so that you're building the racing skill set. And so we'll talk about kind of both elements here, starting with the A race concept, choosing those peaks. I think there's a few things to be thinking about there. One is obviously peak appropriately, meaning don't choose too many, which we've talked about already. Another thing I like to remind people of is that you want those peaks to mean something to you. They shouldn't be random. People sometimes will just say, hey, I'm going to do that race because everybody else is doing it. And maybe there's a reason to do it for that reason. Maybe you have a community connection that draws you to a race that is really strong and palpable. But if you're not excited about something, regardless of the distance, then it doesn't really make sense to me to put it on the calendar. So you should have some level of excitement and connection to a race before you pick it as an A race. And then obviously it should make sense within the context of what you're trying to work on and all of the other logistics that might be associated with traveling there and getting there. So in some cases, a local race might be a better option for you than traveling somewhere if budget is a consideration. So those variables start to come into play as you're picking those big milestones along the way. What am I missing there? Anything?
No, I mean, I think if you're in a performance mindset, you have to listen to what was just said. Like, if you're truly into saying, I'm curious how much I can get out of this sport, I want to know how good I could be, then absolutely the weight, those peaks should matter so much. And then, yeah, any C race becomes similar to like tune-ups, etc. And there is a difference, but still, it's like those can feed that most important moment. But I think even that is important for people to get in touch with, because there's no judgment if you're in it just for like fun and experience. It's cool. Like, you know, but you should do that with eyes wide open. I think it's tough when athletes come off as though it's cool, calm, and casual. And it's like, I'm just here for a good time and fun, and other people pick my races. But then there's tears on the other side, or there's confusion on the other side. And it's like, well, you know, like you took the enjoyable approach but wanted the performance output, and I'm sorry, those two don't always deliver the same results. So you got to get in touch with that and be clear. Or I call it, do it eyes wide open. Like, if it's a fun season and a fun race, we're not prescribing that or recommending that. I'm just saying, if that's what's going on, cool, we're not trying to twist or change your mind. But if you are curious, like, I wonder how good I could get, what you just said about making sure they are important and meaningful to you, that matters so much more for that athlete.
Yeah, you can't chase two rabbits, as Eliud Kipchoge says. You can't both have fun as a primary goal and then be disappointed if you don't get the time that you had secretly in your head. Those two things don't get to work together. And so, yeah, pick your goals. Make sure pick your goal races. Make sure they're races that mean something to you and that fit into the overall plan in a way that makes sense. Again, you're putting them in pencil. The ones 18 months out might be in pencil. You might not have a bib yet, but at least you have something to work towards and a general idea of how it's all going to fit together. And so then the next question becomes, okay, am I going to do any quote prep races, or we like to call them C races, in prep for a run to an A race or not? And again, we've talked about this a little bit already, using the quote from Alan Cousins, a coach I follow from Colorado. He says, people do too many A races and B races and not enough C races. C races being the races that should be fun in an air quote sense, meaning they're not an A race, but have some purpose for them that is pointed towards the A race, so that it doesn't take away from your build towards your peak, but rather it's something you build upon. And so it's often a race that you're not doing all out, that you have a specific executional plan that you want to put together in order to work on racing, work on pacing, work on strategy, so that you don't destroy your body while also learning something. Think of it as a long workout, for example. And so we have a couple of thoughts about this that I think people might get confused about. And I want to be really clear in here and say, you don't have to do a C race. You don't have to do a C race. If you're doing a marathon, you don't have to do a half marathon before that. If you're doing a 10K, you don't have to do a 5K before that. Or if you're doing a half, you don't have to do a 10K. So it's something that should be thought about in a sense of, what do I need to get ready for the A race, the peak race? What does that race require? And for some people, it requires some at-bats working on execution that might be beneficial towards that race. But for others, it might be a distraction, maybe something you don't need, or maybe something that's going to be too hard for you to hold back on, that you destroy your body and then therefore defeat your attempt at your A race. And as we build our training, everything you need is in the training. You don't necessarily have to have the C races or prep races. And I want to make that really clear because I think there's confusion perhaps about it. Now, again, you might be someone who needs the C races for whatever reason to work on something, to make sure you're mentally ready to execute well for your A race. But for a lot of people, it might actually be too dangerous. So we want to make sure that you're first intentional about, do I need it or not? If not, don't do it. If so, then have a reason for doing it. And then we give guidelines in the book, which we can talk about briefly now, about where those C races might sit, for example, relative to your A race. If you're doing a marathon, we will say you might do a half if you're using it as a prep race 5 to 8 weeks out from your marathon. If you're doing a half, then you might do a 10K 3 to 6 weeks out from your half. And there's other guidelines in the book about that. But the point being, it needs to be intentional, have a plan, and sit at a space that's going to allow you the time to recover, to assimilate your lessons, and then still go get the most out of your A race.
Yeah, and you were talking about for some, they may not be able to hold back. I mean, that's something we do often run into because they're in it and they want to get after it. But I think when you say intentional, I think instead of just looking at every race, especially C races, as like, this is my opportunity to sink my teeth in and just let everything, like let the horse out of the gate. When you say be intentional, I think that includes like working out, like your pre-race routine, how you get to not like quote a specific start line, but how you approach a race morning, how comfortable you are on start line. Some people need that exposure in order to get comfortable. Others, they love it and they feel free there and they're going to run unbridled. So they may need to quote stay away from it. So it gets pretty individualized there at that point. And I would say, for the most part, if you don't, I think it's ideal if someone's working with a coach if they're going to start lining up C races, because without a coach, I think they can start to overdo it in the way of just like they're going to stick with their regular qualities and they're going to add these races, which starts to really beat up their body. So I prefer people do that with the consultation of a coach, or I'll say now that at the very least, if you're going to add in a C race or a tune-up race, you need to adjust your quality that week and modify it and make sure that it's it can be quick, but fairly low stimulus. It's not something people should be coming out exhausted from and then double up that weekend and go crush some hard race.
Yeah, it should be additive and it should be intentional. And for some people, that means not doing it. For some people, that means doing it and having a specific plan for doing it. But all of it should point towards getting the most out of your A race, putting all of your eggs in that basket so that you can give yourself the best chance to get the big goal. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. You're wasting your time. You're wasting your big attempt on the wrong thing. So I know that can be hard to be that particular and intentional because, again, we all have this tendency to want to kind of hedge our bets, so to speak. But it's so important to truly go for it in the right way and give yourself the best chance to peak at the right time. Okay, well, I think that wraps our conversation on this topic of kind of thinking in these 12 to 18 month windows. I know it's hard, but as we had a challenge in last week's episode, and I want to invoke a challenge here, which is for those that are listening, regardless of what you have planned, and maybe you already have an idea of what your next 12 to 18 months looks like, but just go spend some time. Take 20, 30 minutes while you're eating lunch or hanging out, waiting for your kid to get finished soccer practice or whatever you might be doing, waiting in the line at checkout somewhere, and just start to think about, what does this look like for me? If I were to pick one primary goal and then over 3-6 month chunks leading to that primary goal, if I were to write down the training objectives and the potential peak race in each of those buckets and the mileage associated with it, what would that look like? What does that wake up in you, as you like to say? And how does that start to piece together a plan that will more perhaps effectively get you to what you want than your current path? And let's just see where it leads you. And that'll be a fun homework assignment for our listeners. All right. We'll wrap it here then. As always, you can check us out at roguerunning.com, where all of our training options, including virtual ones, are available. You can also check us out at Rogue Running on Instagram and join us at 2 p.m. Friday Central for our Q&As live there if you're interested in interacting with us and following us. And then hopefully we'll see you or talk to you next week.